Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Livingston, and I am the Bitcoin Wizard. Today, we're going to be talking about the moral case for Bitcoin and why Bitcoin ends the war machine. There's a little quote I want to start with from Mayor Rothschild. "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." That line hints at a very uncomfortable truth that monetary power is political power. When a government can conjure currency with a few keystrokes, it acquires the means to project violence far beyond what citizens would ever approve of if the bill arrived as direct tax. In other words, fiat money is the silent partner of every modern war, and today I'm going to expose that hidden partnership and then show why Bitcoin severs it. History is my evidence, from Nero's clipped denarii to the greenbacks of the American Civil War, from the hyperinflation from the French Revolution to the Federal Reserve notes that has lost 99% of its purchasing power. The pattern is identical. Easy money, easy war, shattered societies. The causality is as clear as physics. Inflate the currency, subsidize conflict, postpone the pain. Eventually, citizens wake up to burned savings in a gravestone economy, but by then, the bombs are already off the assembly line. Gold once checked this madness. A treasury that must settle in bullion feels the weight of every campaign, yet gold is heavy, confiscatable, and ultimately centralized. Governments learn to hoard gold, suspend redemption, and just print paper anyway. Bitcoin closes all of the loopholes. A fixed 21 million supply, open ledger transparency, and self-custody make monetary debasement practically impossible and war financing politically radioactive. If the leaders of this world cannot stealth tax the populace through inflation, they must win genuine, visible consent for every bullet purchased. That single shift, forcing honest accounting for violence, has the power to tame the war machine more effectively than any treaty ever signed. So as I step through these slides, you need to remember that this is not merely a financial innovation. This is the moral firewall of our time. If you fix the money, you raise the true price of conflict to a level politicians can no longer afford. Bitcoin is that fix. Let's examine why. Let's begin with the axiom that most history textbooks tiptoe around, that every war is a monetary event before it is a military one. Armies march on logistics, but logistics march on budgets, and budgets, when they're honest, must come from taxation or hard assets borrowing. The moments that rulers discover a workaround, a printing press, a clipped coin, a central bank window, the moral calculus of war flips from "can we afford this" to "why not?" Consider the data trail in ancient Rome. In the 3rd century crisis, silver content of the denarius plunged from 90 to single digits. Coinage supply then soared, frontier legions mushroomed, and the empire tore itself apart in a near constant civil war. The Song dynasty in China, officials trebled the paper note supply to buy iron and gunpowder for border campaigns. Within a single generation, hyperinflation and Mongol invasion finished them off. In World War I, the instant gold convertibility was suspended in 1914, so combatant governments borrowed and printed on a scale never seen before, resulting in 40 million casualties and the first industrial genocide. And then post-1971 United States, we've been freed from gold. The dollar supply has grown 35x. Military outlays have expanded in lockstep. The U.S. has been at war or in covert conflicts 4 out of every 5 years since Nixon closed the gold window. The pattern is so consistent it deserves scientific status. If you expand the money supply, you expand the battlefield, because inflation is not just an economic side effect, it is the war tax that is levied in advance, disguised as rising prices. Citizens pay with diminished purchasing power instead of blood at first, but eventually the ledger balances in both currencies. Why does the public tolerate this, you ask? Well, that's because fiat financing crushes dissent. When there's no immediate tax hike, no confiscation of gold, only a distant creeping erosion of savings, well, by the time the price is double, the body bags are already filled. And the Congress that declared the war has been re-elected on promises to fight inflation. That is, even if they declared war in the first place, let's be real. So the takeaway for this slide is brutally simple. If you want to diagnose a looming conflict, watch the money printer and not the news headlines. Monetary debasement is is the canary, war is the collapse of the mine. We often treat paper money as a modern convenience, yet the Chinese pioneered it 1,000 years ago. The Song dynasty, facing a booming population and a costly frontier, they replaced heavy copper coins with lightweight notes. And at first, commerce absolutely thrived. Then the emperors discovered the alchemy of the printing block. Within a few decades, the money supply more than tripled. Military outlays absorbed over half of the imperial budget. Prices in the capital city of Kafang rose roughly sixfold in a single lifetime. Merchants hoarded silver, peasants saw wages lag prices, and court officials blamed hoarders rather than their own presses. Does that sound familiar? The real bill came due on the battlefield. Inflated cash lets the Song hire larger armies and buy even more iron, sulfur, and gunpowder. Expansion then just bred retaliation. By 1127, the Chen invaded, capturing the emperor and triggered a southward retreat. Desperate, the southern Song then just printed even faster, which crashed confidence altogether. So when the Khan's Mongols arrived in the 1270s, the dynasty was so weakened by debt and price chaos that resistance just proved futile. Paper money had financed the swords that eventually slit its own purse, and this lesson is timeless. Fiat starts with convenience, but then it morphs into addiction and then ends in systemic fragility. China wrote this cautionary tale a millennium ago, and we ignore it at our own peril. Bitcoin, with its hard cap, offers the opposite script: monetary stability that denies rulers the temptation to gamble innocent lives on the printing press. To totally understand fiat's corrosive power, we travel from the Song era paper to Rome's silver coin, because fiat is not necessarily defined by paper, it is defined by political control over money's substance. Under Augustus, the denarius was 95% pure silver. 2 centuries later, to bankroll frontier wars and pay increasingly mutinous soldiers, emperors quietly clipped and allowed the coin. By the reign of Gallienus in 260 AD, silver contents fell below 5%, and by Aurelian's reform in 274 AD, it bottomed out near 1%. That is a 99% debasement, an ancient version of our dollar's loss against the Federal Reserve. Economic feedback loop was brutal and immediate. Prices in Rome rose 50-fold within a single century. Wage earners defaulted to barter, merchants demanded heavy gold or foreign currencies. The state countered with the first recorded price control edict, proof that monetary lies eventually breed legal violence. And then, as everybody knows, militarily, the empire descended into hyperkinetic chaos. 26 emperors in a 50-year span, most elevated by troops bribed with freshly debased pay. Civil war then became career advancement, and then external enemies poured through borders manned by soldiers whose salaries evaporated between paydays. And this is why monetary debasement and political violence are twins. Rome's coin clipping fed its legions, but it also fed the empire's collapse. If you fix the money, you starve the engine of conquest. So picture 1789 Paris, soaring ideals of liberty, egalitarianism, and fraternity, yet an empty treasury. Revolutionary leaders seized church lands and issued paper receipts called assignats, which were supposedly backed by confiscated property. It began a clever bridge loan. Within 3 years, it became a monetary guillotine. So we saw a particular convention print over 6 billion of them, 6 times the original supply, to pay for wars against Austria, Prussia, and internal revolts that was happening. Bread prices exploded 100x, so when grain costs a week's wages, liberty turns to riot. Price controls such as the law of the maximum followed, and then the reign of terror, proof that when money breaks, politics radicalizes. A nation that overprinted to fight foreign monarchs ended up guillotining its own citizens. It literally only took 6 years for fiat's inevitable collapse. By 1796, the assignat was worth less than the paper that it was printed on. Commerce froze, the army mutinied for coin, and Napoleon's coup emerged from the vacuum, which was funded, ironically, by another round of a different paper, which also crashed. Hyperinflation paved the road from Enlightenment republic to military dictatorship. So the lesson is pretty clear, folks. Not only does the fiat financing create wars externally, but tyranny internally. The fiat bought cannonballs back then at the cost of the bread the next day and civil liberties the day after. Gold eventually restored a bit of stability, but only Bitcoin's cryptographic scarcity can render such abuse impossible because there can be no confiscated lands, no money printer, no guillotine, just 21 million incorruptible units that make honest governance the cheapest option and aggressive war the most expensive folly imaginable. So if fiat money was a saber rattling around in the treasury, the classical gold standard was a sheathed sword tied to the scabbard. From Waterloo to Sarajevo, almost a full century, the great powers of Europe avoided large-scale war, not because their kings magically became pacifists, but because their treasuries were chained to bullion. Gold's convertibility acted like a fiscal truth serum. To fight, you first had to pay in metal and not in promises. And 3 data points really illustrate the discipline. Number 1 is price stability. Wholesale prices across Britain, France, and the United States fluctuated less than 1% per year on average. In Britain, the same basket that cost £100 in 1815 cost 93 in 1913, which is a 120-year deflation of just 7%. Now we get that in 1 year. Contrast that with the dollar debasement since the Federal Reserve came along. Number 2 is a limited debt. Britain public debt fell from 260% of the GDP in 1815 thanks to the Napoleonic Wars to 28% by 1914. States that cannot print must repay or default and lose credibility. The incentive overwhelmingly favors peace. Number 3, there were just fewer great power wars, excluding brief outliers like the Franco-Prussian War. Europe's militaries mostly saber-rattled through diplomacy. Historian John Maynard Keynes, I know, I'm sorry, but he did call it the economic Pax Britannica. That's when trading volumes rose 6-fold, real wages doubled, and steamships and telegraphs bound continents together. So why did gold work? Because it welded fiscal reality to political ambition. If you want Crimea, borrow gold at 4%, then the bondholders will judge you. Gold literally standardized honesty across countries' borders. It imposed a low time preference culture where capital started to chase railroads and not rifles. But note the corollary: the very moments that nations suspended gold in 1914, they unlocked Armageddon. Within weeks, money printing outpaced artillery shells. 4 years later, 40 million people were dead. The experiment proved both gold's virtue and vulnerability. Centralized vaults can be commandeered, but Bitcoin retains the virtue without the vulnerability. It is gold's ethical essence stripped of physical seizure risk and fortified by cryptographic sovereignty. The gold standard gave us a glimpse of monetary peace, but Bitcoin is offering a permanent architecture for it. So now let's talk a little bit about the chain reaction, more specifically about World War I. In August 1914, Europe performs the monetary magic trick with genocidal consequences. That's when it shut the gold window. Within 30 days, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary all declared that their banknotes were no longer redeemable for metal. Instantly, the fiscal leash on all of their generals snapped. What Keynes later called the economic foundations of civilization were pulverized overnight. It's crazy that even Keynes got all this stuff right. So observe the chain reaction. Number 1, we had money creation for the first time on an industrial scale. Each belligerent expanded its monetary base by 10x over the next 4 years. Britain's national debt vaulted from 30% of the GDP to 150% of the GDP. Germany's mark supply ballooned 5-fold. France's franc quadrupled. When money costs nothing, shells and trenches cost nothing until the invoice arrives in blood. And then inflation served as an invisible draft. Civilian prices in London and Berlin rose 20 to 30% per year, but of course, wages lagged very far behind. The difference was the stealth tax that fed the front. Soldiers were conscripted overtly, but civilians were conscripted covertly through the printing press. And then we had 40 million casualties and one monetary innovation. For the first time in history, governments could wage a 4-year globe-spanning conflict without running out of coin. Fiat finance upgraded war from a limited campaign to a self-perpetuating meat grinder. When gold discipline dissolved, human life became the cheapest commodity on the continent. And then this kind of marked the beginning of the central bank century. The newly minted U.S. Federal Reserve, barely 9 months old, pivoted from lender of last resort to quartermaster of empire. They were monetizing treasury debt so thoroughly that by 1917, open market operations meant war on installments. The Great War midwifed the permanent marriage of central banking and militarism. The moral lesson could not be more clear. Suspend sound money and you suspend civilizational restraint. Gold's breach did not merely finance bigger battalions, it normalized the idea that human destiny can be altered by keystrokes and creditors that are yet unborn. We need Bitcoin. We need to fix the money, or history promises that we'll replay 1914 with 21st century weaponry, and I don't think any of us want that. Proved that suspending gold ignites war. 1971 proved that abolishing gold institutionalizes it. When President Nixon closed the gold window on August 15, 1971, he did more than end Bretton Woods. He inaugurated an era in which every currency on earth became an experiment in unlimited issuance. The constraint of metal was replaced by the discretion of bureaucrats, and the discretion of bureaucrats is invariably to spend. 4 quick metrics to expose the geopolitical fallout from this moment. Number 1 is monetary expansion without precedent. US M2 money stock has risen from $700 billion in 1971 to $21 trillion today, a 30-fold increase. Global debt has surpassed $300 trillion, quadrupling in 4 decades. Cheap money writes blank checks to every lobby, including the one that builds missiles. And now we have a perpetual war economy. Since 1971, the United States has been military engaged for all but 8 years, from Vietnam's endgame to Lebanon, Panama, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and dozens of covert theaters. The cost has been about $50 trillion in direct outlays and interest, financed not by wartime tax hikes, but by bond sales the Fed stands ready to monetize. There is an inflation war tax happening. Did you know that the dollar purchasing power has fallen between 97% and 99% since the Federal Reserve's birth, but 85% of that erosion occurred after the gold link was broken? The average American household has lost the equivalent of 1 full year's salary per decade to silent debasement, an involuntary levy funding campaigns most citizens never voted on. This is a moral hazard on a global scale. Superpowers no longer weigh against bullion reserves. They weigh it against next quarter's CPI print, manageable with their statistical gymnastics. And emerging nations actually just emulate the playbook. They print, devalue, militarize, and implode. From Argentina's Falklands gamble to Russia's 1990 hyperinflation and onward, Fiat's pathology metastasizes. The geopolitical ledger is unambiguous. A world of pure fiat is a world where war is a line item, not an existential decision. When money is conjured, coffins are discounted. In short, 1971, a fuse was lit that still burns, and Bitcoin is the only firebreak that we've ever invented. So up to now, gold has been history's most effective speed limit on state violence. But gold has had 2 fatal weaknesses: centralization and hypothecation. It piles up in vaults that armies can seize, and banks can quietly issue more claims than bars, inflating on paper while pretending to be sound. World War I exploited both loopholes in the first month of conflict, but Bitcoin closes them mathematically and geopolitically. With Bitcoin, there is scarcity with no backdoor. Gold grows 1 to 2% a year. A government can boost it via mining booms or conquest. With Bitcoin, you're fixed at 21 million forever. The halving schedule is public, immutable, and immune to pickaxes or parliaments. There is no more to plunder or print with Bitcoin. And 60% of gold right now sits in a handful of state and bullion bank vaults. One invasion or executive order, see 1933, reroutes the flow. But with Bitcoin, obviously, custody is a private key. It can live on a flash drive, a phone, or a memorized seed phrase spread across continents. There is no Fort Knox to capture, no truck convoy to intercept. With Bitcoin, the transparency exposes the fractional fakery of gold. With gold, true reserve ratios are very opaque. Claims may exceed metal. See the London gold pool in the 1960s. With Bitcoin, every coin, every block, every issuance event is auditable in real time. If someone tries to create paper BTC, the blockchain can just ignore the forgery. Accountability is baked into the protocol, not dependent on auditors. And then under a Bitcoin standard, a state that wants rockets must acquire real Bitcoin either through taxation, an explicit political cost, or by borrowing an explicit market cost. No central bank can dilute public savings to subsidize crusades. The stealth war tax of inflation is technically impossible. And then there's this cultural consequence, the low time preference civics. Hard, self-sovereign money rewires incentives on a societal-wide basis, from immediate consumption and militaristic glory to long-term capital formation. Societies that save in an appreciating assets have more to lose from war and more to gain from trade. So the bottom line, gold taught rulers restraint until they discovered vault doors and printing presses. Bitcoin erases both of those vulnerabilities. It is gold's monetary virtue rendered in software and defended by global consensus rather than bayonets. In a Bitcoin world, war is no longer charge it to future generations. It is pay cash or stay home. History suggests most politicians will choose home. Now we have traced a brutal arc from Rome's clip denarius to Nixon's suspended gold window. Every chapter of large-scale violence has been footprinted in the balance sheet of fiat debasement, and the evidence is overwhelming. When money is a political spreadsheet, war becomes a line item on the spreadsheet. When money is an immutable law of nature, war becomes an indictment. So here is the fork in the road. One path is familiar, the other one historic. Path A, you can stay fiat. National debts accelerate toward the event horizon of default or hyperinflation. Central banks underwrite fresh conflicts with keyboard credits, hiding the cost in tomorrow's diluted paychecks. The public, numbed by CPI metrics that exclude everything painful, slides into perpetual low-grade serfdom. Or you can have path B, opt into Bitcoin. The war tax of stealth inflation is mathematically impossible. Politicians must fund guns with honest, visible levies, and instant referendum on every single missile produced. Citizens hold their wealth in self-custody, expropriation, and currency debasement. Historically, the twin engines of conflict meet cryptographic resistance. So capital, liberated from debasement risk, pours into productivity rather than military-industrial arbitrage. Low time preference culture flourishes. Diplomacy, not debt finance violence, becomes the cheapest path. So choosing path B is not utopian, it is simply rational. Bitcoin is the first monetary technology that makes peace cheaper than war, truth cheaper than propaganda, and saving cheaper than spending. So I have 4 action steps for you listening. This is how we change the world, my dearest little captains. Number 1, we have to educate. We have to share this historical data and expose the fiat war feedback loop. We need to self-custody, so move, even modestly, from inflating currency to sovereign Bitcoin. A seed phrase is a vote against endless war. Number 3, you need to demand fiscal honesty. You need to challenge leaders. If the cause is just, fund it without stealth inflation. And number 4, we need to build on top of Bitcoin. We need to support payment rails, businesses, and civic institutions that settle in hard money. Every new node is a treaty for peace. We are the first generation with a tool that permanently severs monetary policy from militaristic impulse. History will judge whether we deployed that tool or whether we remained the last captives of the printing press. The choice is yours, mine, and ours. Fix the money, ends the war machine. My name is Adam Livingston. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this content, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family, those who need to hear the gospel of the orange the most. Thank you so much. Have a terrific day. Class dismissed.